Well, good day, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. This is a project that I've been meaning to work on since November of 2019, almost a year ago. This was a gift of Jose from London, England, and this is a toy typewriter, Petite Deluxe International toy typewriter with a case. And I have to confess, early on, I wasn't really sure how I was going to approach this because I'm not really an expert on toy typewriters, nor do I collect toy typewriters. But there is a whole world of toy typewriters out there. So I'd like to talk a little bit about toy typewriters and just take a look at this machine and see what it does. Stay tuned. Well, if you look at the world of antique toys over the last, let's say, century, there are certainly toy versions of almost every adult object. Automobiles, tractors, every kind of household implement, right? The Easy Bake Oven, for instance. Just a lot of different kinds of ways that we use toys in our culture to educate kids about real adult activities. And so I kind of find it interesting. If you look at the world of toy typewriters, there's a lot of arcane and obscure brands that may not be familiar to you unless you're a collector. Things like, well, first of all, there was a whole series of Barbie toy typewriters. Now, some of them were actually kind of electronic daisy wheel machines, but there also were Type Bar Barbie toy typewriters, Type Bar machines. There's the Buddy L, there's a Juniors, there's the Lilliput, there's the Marks and the Marks Writer, there's the Petite Super, so this is the Petite line, there's the Petite Super International, a whole series of those, the Petite Super Juniors, there's the Simplex, there's the Tom Thumb typewriters, and a whole number of other models and brands that I haven't listed. Robert Messinger, the typewriter expert from Australia, has on his website a really interesting article about, he has a number of articles about toy typewriters, but one in particular has a lot of photos, and I'll drop a link to that down below. Well, as adults, right, we're living in a post-typewriter era, so we use typewriters differently than what they were used for when they originally were manufactured. Back in the day, typewriters were kind of the equivalent of what we use computers for. People wrote with typewriters. They wrote personal letters. They wrote business correspondence, et cetera, et cetera. So a typewriter was a vital part of a professional person's life and the life of a writer or whatever. So it's no surprise that we would have a whole assortment of toy typewriters to choose from. So people would see the toy typewriter as an opportunity, maybe parents would, to educate their children, give them this toy that would teach them the keyboard, the basics of how typewriters work, and maybe when the kids got older they would want to have a real typewriter. They were intended to be fun, but at the same time they had kind of an ulterior purpose in mind. Well, first you might notice that it does come with a case, and I'm actually rather impressed by the quality of the case. You know, I've seen worse cases on Olivetti Letteras, for instance, but this is a fairly hard shell case, kind of a vinyl synthetic leather covering that's actually stitched. The corners are rigid, the body panels of the case are rigid. It actually has some pretty good quality hinges and some rivets on the bottom here, and there is an actual clasp with a key lock and a handle, and I've seen worse handles on full-size typewriters. And if you look on the inside of this, it has this kind of a pattern to it, a fabric pattern, and it has these little plastic bumpers on the bottom that help keep the machine centered in the case to protect it. So actually rather impressive case for a toy typewriter. And of course it has the Petite logo here on the front of the case, and the case is a little worn and discolored from a lot of use over the years, but pretty impressive nonetheless. Okay, the typewriter itself, well, on the bottom of the typewriter, on the underneath side, there's some interesting markings. Well, of course, it's the Petite typewriter. There is a service department. Here's sort of the address, Petite Typewriters, Rye Street, New Basford, Nottingham. There's some patent numbers. There was a machine serial number, and you can see the evidence of the adhesive. The paper came off. It is made in England. Here is the ribbon number, a T4430. It's a 1/4 inch wide ribbon. It's distributed by Matoy Playcraft Sales Limited. Well, the origin of this typewriter is slightly obscure. In the 1950s, the Petite Typewriter company out of Nottingham, they were definitely making these toy typewriters, but later on, by the 70s, they were known to being marketed by Byron Jardine Limited. So somehow that brand became marketed through a different company. I'm not really sure why. But anyways, the Byron Jardine Limited also was selling toy typewriters under the Byron name, and the Byron was a full-size adult manual typewriter also made in England, and there's some articles about that on Richard Polt's website specifically. There's a Byron and a Byron Mark I that is listed on the typewriter database as a toy typewriter, and there's also the Petite Super International that's listed on the typewriter database. So some of these are being registered or listed there. This particular sample is missing the serial number label on the bottom, so I don't really have a serial number to date it by. It's a toy typewriter, and there are a lot of other kinds of toy typewriters out there, as I mentioned earlier, but a lot of those typewriters were indexing typewriters. In fact, if you look at some of the earliest typewriter designs, patent designs, a lot of them were indexing typewriters. Indexing typewriters use a print wheel that is very much like one of these embossing label makers. And the toy typewriters, like your Simplex and all those, had a indexing wheel. And on some of the typewriters, the platen was fixed, or the carriage didn't move back and forth, and instead the wheel slid back and forth. Others, the wheel was fixed in the middle and the carriage moved back and forth, and they had a rubber platen roller and an actual piece of ribbon connected across them, and it had a stamped metal painted body that looked like it had keys, but it was really an indexing typewriter like this label maker. Here's a later version of a Dymo label maker. This is more recent, a plasticky one. Not built quite as well as the earlier ones, but these have their legacy back in the indexing typewriter days, the early days of the formative years of the typewriter, which connects, of course, to toy typewriters also. But this Petite typewriter is not an indexing typewriter. This actually has, yes, type bars, key levers, a movable carriage, an escapement mechanism, a ribbon that actually turns and auto-reverses. It has all the features, essentially, of a real manual typewriter. Well, this Petite certainly has some stylings from the 1960s and maybe early 70s. And it is a 3-bank typewriter. And it, like 3-bank typewriters, it has a caps shift, it's 2 cap shift keys, and it has a figure shift key because each type bar has 3 symbols on the type slugs. And of course a space bar, a backspace key that is all functional. So it is interesting. It is a functional typewriter made mostly of plastic parts. And yes, it has a functional carriage return lever that actually indexes the line spacing by 1 full line, as well as the platen knobs. They do the same thing. It's a full line spacing machine. The carriage can be moved manually by pulling forward this lever on the left side, and then you can move the carriage back and forth freely. And otherwise, you can move it against the spring tension to the right like that. If you move it back to the left, you have to pull this lever forward, which is essentially like a carriage release lever. And on the right side, you have, of course, the right platen knob, and this lever here will release the pressure rollers underneath the platen so that you can feed paper freely. It has a paper bale that is spring-loaded, and it has a paper scale on the paper bale. The platen itself is a plastic core with a thin layer of actual rubber. So it is a true platen, and as I indicated earlier, this is a true type bar machine, and so if you pull the ribbon cover off, we get to see, yes, the type bars. So yes, it has metal ribbon spools with a 1/4 inch thick ribbon, and it's inked in blue ink, and it's pretty dry. It needs to be re-inked. So as you move the carriage back and forth, the ribbon turns. As you press the space bar, the ribbon turns, and of course as you type, the ribbon turns. It does have an auto-reverse mechanism. Now Jose, who originally had it, indicated that the ribbon reversing mechanism was intermittently not working, and I think it's been working for me so far. The ribbon wraps around this simple guide, and it goes through these two plastic loops in the ribbon vibrator. There is a plastic piece here that acts like a spring to dampen the shock on the type bar, but the right side of this little piece is broken. And then on the right spool, of course, it has a guide and the take-up spool there. And again, as I say, it does reverse itself the ribbon direction. So you take off these little plastic pieces, which by the way are very easy to drop into the machine. How do I know that? Yes, well, that won't go there. Again, metal spools, and there is a little plastic disc with a pin on it that as you type, that disc moves, and it moves the ribbon via these holes here in the bottom of the spool. So these are metal spools, and I'm guessing that it's possible these spools might have been originally used in some kind of an adding machine or calculator, because they're metal. They're way too heavy to have been designed just for a toy typewriter. So they were probably adapted from some other type of use. So there is this type bar rest, this metal wire thing, and it has this kind of square cross-section plastic piece that supports these. And the type bars have this little protrusion on the bottom of them that hits this rest when they return, and it makes a pretty loud clanking noise. Like if you wanted to quiet it down, you could put something soft in there like felt or some kind of foam. That's actually some of the louder parts of the operation of this machine, is just the type bars falling back and hitting this rest. So it has a segment, and it is not a segment shift, though. It's a carriage shift machine. There is an extra slot in the segment on either end of it, so like maybe there was a different model that used 2 more additional keys or whatever, and there are apparently room on the keyboard right here for 2 additional keys, it looks like. So some of the type bar linkages are a little wonky. As you can see, some of these type bars are sticking up higher than they should be. I have to also mention that in the process when I first got this and started testing it, this P and the number 0 type bar broke right here at the joint, and I had to epoxy it back together, and unfortunately it prints a little high, so the type alignment is not really perfect when I epoxied that back. So that's just an artifact of the fact that it broke. And the type alignment on this machine is not great, as you might expect, but it's a toy typewriter. What can you say? So connected to each key lever is this molded plastic rod that has been drawn out to be extra thin. The extra thin part up here on top connects to the key lever. And then there's a metal spring. Each one of these goes through a metal spring, and the shoulder between the thin part and the thick part is grabbed by the metal spring, and that's what provides spring tension for each key. So it's a plastic molded rod, flexible rod that actually does the linkage from the key lever to the type bar. And then the type bars are made of aluminum alloy, and they're being pulled by those plastic rods. Here you can see the letter P on the end. So the ribbon cover is plastic. It has this little protrusion, these sets of protrusions that fit into these little slots to hold the ribbon cover in place, like that. Well, despite it being a toy typewriter, it has the full set of digits 1 through 0, using the figure shift key to access them. And then the middle row has some punctuation marks, including parentheses, the British pound, the American dollar, and percentage. And the bottom has more symbols, including 3 fractions, which is kind of usual with a lot of British or English keyboards, and more of your punctuation marks here. Very much a 3-bank typewriter type keyboard, like you would expect from a, for instance, a Corona 3 or a lot of the other older 1920s, 19-teens style 3-bank typewriters, and a space bar and a backspace key. I kind of like the little detail here of the triangular arrow and a little white triangular arrow on the inside of it, which is kind of a nice detail. So this typewriter is approximately 9 characters per inch as I count them. So a little bit larger than the standard pica size. So the left margin scale starts at -5, but the carriage only moves to the 0 point. So really I think what you're supposed to do is set the left edge of your paper here at -5, and then the actual typing position starts at 0. And the carriage will move up to the 60, and the edge of the paper, if it's an A4 size paper, the edge of the paper would be out here about 63. So I'll get my paper lined up here on the edge. Well, let's give it a try, shall we? Yes, it types, and the ribbon is in need of re-inking. The type bar alignment is obviously pretty bad. As far as aligning these type bars, if you really wanted to, they are made of aluminum, and so there's a possibility you could probably try bending them, but it's a little fragile. I would be very cautious to do that. And here I've just typed all capitals here, and it's actually not too bad at times. There's probably a little bit of variability to the way it types because it doesn't really have a type guide like a real typewriter would have. So these type bars might be bending back and forth a little bit as they fly into the ribbon. And yes, you can use carbon paper on this Petite typewriter. So the blue letters down below are the original impression from the ribbon, and the black letters above are off of the carbon paper. So it actually gives a fairly decent impression, even though the type slugs themselves are plastic. So yeah, carbon paper is an option if your ribbon is running dry or if you don't have a ribbon anymore. The thing about toy typewriters, of course, is in their day, they were toys intended for children to mimic the activities of grown-ups. I could see there was an educational value in this. You were actually teaching kids keyboarding, the order of the keys, the QWERTY keyboard, and in general how a typewriter works. So when they get a little older, they could get themselves a real student-type typewriter. These days, however, students are going to have laptop computers or little netbook computers or little mobile devices with some kind of keyboard input, perhaps, to teach them keyboarding and the skills you need to navigate a digital world. But having said that, of course, people like us that love typewriters, we still think that children should be taught how to use a manual typewriter, and probably a toy typewriter like this is not the best way to go about that because these are so fragile. These are more like collector's items. So if you're interested in getting a young kid into manual typewriters, probably go ahead and just get them an inexpensive adult manual typewriter, something that basically functions, and they'll be happier with it than trying to struggle with a toy typewriter that's most likely going to break because of the fragility of the parts. Well, there you go, toy typewriters. There is a world out there, a whole world of collectors who are interested in these devices. And how about you? Do you guys collect toy typewriters among real typewriters also? Well, if so, drop me a note down below. I know there's a whole lot more to say about toy typewriters that I haven't said, but this is an introduction to the whole subject. And I, again, want to thank my friend Jose over in England for sending me this and allowing me the opportunity to review it. Well, guys, stay creative and stay well. And until next time, have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.